The feed was 48 hours old. That was how long the relay took from Ardennes Prime to Strategic Command. 48 hours of signal traveling through the standard network at the speed of bureaucratic infrastructure, which was not the speed of light, but was the speed of a civilization that had decided routine communication did not need to be instantaneous. Elena Vasquez had learned to live with the 48-hour delay the way you learn to live with anything that could not be changed, which was by not thinking about it directly and instead thinking about the things around it, the shape of it, the way it sat in the periphery of everything else she did. On the screen, a child was running. The feed was from the colony's central settlement, the Morning Market District, the kind of footage that Ardennes Prime's public communication office released on the standard relay because colonies like to show themselves living, like to put into the signal something that said we are here and we are building and look at what we are making. The child was maybe 6 years old, running in the way that 6-year-olds ran, with the total commitment of a body that had not yet learned to conserve energy for later, chasing something that the camera angle did not quite show. Maybe a ball, maybe just running because running was what you did when you were 6, and the morning was clear, and the terraformed sky of Ardennes Prime was the particular shade of pale blue that 3 years of atmospheric processing had produced. Elena watched it. She watched it because her daughter was on that planet and she had not seen her in 2 years, and this was the closest thing available. She had been watching the feed for 4 minutes when her aide, Lieutenant Priya Anand, came through the door of her office with the particular quality of controlled urgency that meant the thing Elena had been calculating toward for 3 years had arrived. She knew before Anand spoke. She said, "How many ships?" Anand said, 240, Commander. The Reach Collective's primary expansion fleet. Jump destination confirmed Ardennes Prime. Estimated arrival 18 hours. Hours in range. 73 vessels across 3 fleet elements. They would need to converge immediately. How long to converge? 16 hours, if they move in the next 15 minutes. Elena looked at the screen. The child was still running. The market behind her was the morning market, stalls opening, people moving through the early light 48 hours ago on a planet that currently had 18 hours before 240 collective warships arrived at its boundary. She watched it for 3 more seconds. Then she stood up. "Get me Strategic Command, all senior staff, 5 minutes." 3 years ago, Elena Vasquez had stood in front of the Galactic Assembly's formal session and presented a 40-page threat assessment that represented 3 years of prior analysis. Every piece of data her intelligence division had been able to compile on the Reach Collective's expansion methodology, and the complete professional credibility she had built over 22 years of service staked on its accuracy. The assembly chamber was large and designed to be large, the kind of architecture that communicated the weight of what happened in it. 40 species in their designated tiers looking down at the presentation floor, where Elena stood with her display and her document, and the specific quality of composure she had learned to maintain in rooms that made her feel small deliberately. She had not felt small, she had felt precise. She had laid out the collective's expansion pattern across 11 species in 40 years. Rate of acceleration, projected vectors, the 3 human border colonies that fell directly in the path of the projection within 5 years, the collective's absorption methodology, not destruction, not negotiation, replacement. Move in, establish control, relocate or integrate the existing population into the labor structure, file the sector as collective territory, move to the next one. 11 times. Consistent pattern, no deviation. The assembly had listened with the attention that bodies listened with when they were deciding whether to take something seriously. A Dravki senior representative had said, carefully, that the Reach Collective had maintained assembly membership for 200 years, and its expansion had always been conducted within the assembly's legal frameworks. A Veth delegate had suggested that human border colonies, being a relatively recent development, might benefit from a territorial adjustment discussion with the collective that could be facilitated through assembly mediation channels. A Keithrani observer had noted that Commander Vasquez's analysis, while thorough, relied on projection models that contained inherent uncertainty ranges. Alina had listened to all of it. Then she had said, in the flat tone that she had prepared specifically, because the flat tone was better than what she actually felt, I am formally advising the Galactic Assembly that if the Reach Collective's expansion continues on its current vector into human border systems, humanity will respond with its full military capability. I am requesting that this advisory be formally noted in the Assembly record. The Assembly had noted it formally in the Assembly record. Then they had moved to the next item on the agenda. Alina had walked out of the Assembly chamber and into the corridor and stood for a moment outside the doors with Anand beside her, and Anand had said quietly, "They filed it, Commander." Alina had said, "Yes. They actually filed it." Yes, she had stood in the corridor for a moment. Then she had said, "All right," and she had gone back to work. The Strategic Command Center was underground, which was not unusual for facilities of its classification, but it was underground in a way that felt permanent rather than temporary. The kind of construction that said this will be here when the surface has changed several times. 14 senior officers around the central table when Alina walked in, the display showing the Ardennes Prime System and the collective fleet's projected approach vector, and the 73 UEDF vessels converging from their current positions. Alina did not sit down. She stood at the head of the table and presented the situation the way she always presented situations, completely and without softening, because her staff were professionals and professionals were owed accuracy. 240 collective vessels, 18 hours, Ardennes Prime, 600,000 people, a terraforming operation 3 years into a projected 20-year development program. The nearest UEDF reinforcement beyond the converging 73 was 31 hours away, which was 13 hours too late to matter for the first engagement. 73 UEDF ships against 240 collective warships. General Marcus Harmon, 60 years of service, the kind of officer who had been in enough situations to have stopped being surprised by situations, looked at the tactical display for a moment and said, "Those are not comfortable numbers, Commander." "No, sir." 73 against 240. "Yes, sir." "Alone." Alina looked at him. "They won't be alone, sir." A pause. Harmon looked at her. He had known her for 11 years, and he could read the quality of what she was not saying as well as he could read what she was saying. Something moved behind his eyes that was not quite recognition, but was adjacent to it, the look of someone arriving at an answer they had been approaching for a long time. "Full weight," he said. "Yes, sir." "You've been building it." "Since the day the Assembly filed my report and thanked me for my time, sir. 3 years." Harmon looked at the display, then at Alina. He said, "Brief us." Full weight was not a plan. It was an architecture, which was a different thing. A plan addressed a situation. An architecture addressed the shape of situations, the underlying geometry of them, the things that would be true regardless of which specific day or which specific engagement or which specific set of variables the situation presented. Alina had spent 3 years building full weight around the Reach Collective's expansion methodology, because the expansion methodology was consistent. 11 times, same pattern, same tactical doctrine, same assumptions about force ratios and formation discipline, and what an opposing force could realistically bring to bear against 240 ships. The assumptions were wrong. Alina had spent 3 years making them wrong. She briefed her staff for 40 minutes. When she was done, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Harmon said, "How confident are you in the positioning data for the strategic reserve?" Admiral Reyes confirmed positioning 8 months ago. they've been holding since 14 months in deep space. Yes, sir. 112 vessels. Yes, sir. Harmon looked at the display. He looked at the numbers. He looked at Alina. He said, "Give the order." Alina gave the order. On Ardennes Prime, at 6:11 hours, 600,000 people's personal comm units received an emergency evacuation alert simultaneously. Mara Vasquez-Chen was in the atmospheric processor control room on the terraforming station's northern installation when her comm unit buzzed. She was running the morning calibration sequence on the processor array, which was a task that required attention, and which she had been giving attention to for the past hour. The kind of focused technical work that Mara had been good at since she was 12 years old, and had taken apart her first climate control unit to see how it worked, and had put it back together correctly, to her father's amazement and her mother's complete lack of surprise. She looked at the alert. She read it twice. She said to the technician working the adjacent console, "Kaido, evacuation order. Shut down your board and go to the transport hub." Kaido said, "What?" "Now, Kaido." She sent a message to Dawn on the southern continent. It said, "Evacuation order. Come to the northern hub, I love you." She sent it and put her comm in her pocket and began the emergency shutdown sequence for the atmospheric processor array, because leaving the array in active mode during an evacuation was a safety hazard, and Mara Vasquez-Chen did not create safety hazards even in emergencies. And when the sequence was done, she walked out of the control room and started helping the people in the corridor get to the transport hub. She did not think about her mother. Thinking about her mother was the thing she could not afford to do right now. She did it anyway for about 4 seconds, then she stopped. Commander Jard Osai had served in the UEDF for 30 years and had commanded fleet engagements in 7 prior operations, and had spent the past 8 months running simulations of a formation that did not exist in any tactical database outside the UEDF's classified planning systems. A formation Alina Vasquez had designed specifically around the gaps in the Reach Collective's doctrine. He arrived at Ardennes Prime 2 hours and 14 minutes before the Collective's fleet, which gave him enough time to position his 73 ships in the configuration the full-weight plan specified, and to say, to his fleet on the command channel, the thing that needed to be said before what came next. "All ships, you know this formation. You've run it 400 times. The Collective's executor is going to see 73 vessels in an arrangement he doesn't recognize, and he is going to make a calculation about what 73 ships can do against 240. A pause. He's going to be wrong. You know why he's going to be wrong. Let's show him." Neth Vaz had been the Reach Collective's expansion fleet commander for 31 years. In those 31 years, he had absorbed 11 species border territories into the Collective's administrative framework, had conducted 43 fleet engagements without a single loss, and had developed the particular certainty that came from being consistently right for long enough that being right stopped feeling like an achievement and started feeling like the natural condition of things. He was not an arrogant man. Arrogance was a failure of assessment, and Neth Vaz prided himself on accurate assessment. He simply had a great deal of data on what happened when a smaller force engaged a larger one with superior formation discipline, and the data was consistent. He had read the human warning document 3 years ago. His intelligence division had flagged it as worth reviewing, and he had reviewed it, and he had found it thorough and well-argued and ultimately not concerning, because the human military capability at the time of writing was not sufficient to make the warning credible. The contingency architecture in Section 7 had been interesting, ambitious, even in its conception. But ambition and execution were different things, and the Collective's intelligence assessment of human military development, compiled 14 months ago, had shown no evidence of the kind of construction program that Section 7's architecture would have required. He had assessed it as aspirational. He arrived at Ardennes Prime, and found 73 human vessels in an unusual formation. He noted the formation. He did not recognize it. He had a complete database of human tactical formations, and this was not in it. He found this mildly interesting in the way that a person who had 143 engagements found tactical novelty mildly interesting. He said to his tactical officer, "Standard approach, all ships." His tactical officer said, "Yes, Executor, 240 against 73. The math is straightforward." "Yes, Executor." I watched the collective fleet begin its standard approach and said, "All ships, execute." The UEDF formation did something the collective had never seen. It disappeared. Not retreated, not dispersed. Separated into 7 independent combat groups, each one moving in a different direction simultaneously, each on a precise vector that had been calculated not randomly but specifically, each group's heading chosen to pull a particular section of the collective fleet out of its formation to pursue. Because a formation that was not being pursued from a single direction was a formation that had to make a decision, and the decision spread out, cover all pursuit vectors. Maintain contact with all 7 groups was the decision Alina had built full weight around. Because the decision was correct tactical doctrine, and correct tactical doctrine in this case was the thing she needed them to do. Nethvaz watched his fleet spread across the engagement zone in 7 pursuit elements and thought about the formation he had just seen dissolve, the one that was not in his database, and felt something stir at the edge of his assessment that he recognized as the sensation of a model beginning to require revision. He let his fleet pursue. The math was still 240 against 73 regardless of how the formation was arranged. The math was, at this moment, not the whole picture. The first 2 hours of the engagement were precise and costly and exactly as the full-weight simulations had projected within a 12% variance, which Alina considered acceptable for a live engagement. Osai's fleet lost 11 ships. The names went into the casualty feed at Strategic Command. 44 crew members per vessel on average. 484 people in the first 2 hours. Names scrolling on the secondary display while Alina watched the primary display and ran the calculations that told her where the engagement was and where it needed to be. The collective lost 29 ships. The math was improving. It was not improving fast enough. On the planet below, the evacuation had been running for 2 hours. 340,000 people loaded and launched. 260,000 still on the ground. Mara had been running for 2 hours. Not literally running, though she had done a fair amount of that, but running in the sense of moving continuously from one problem to the next problem, which was what the evacuation had become after the first transport hub cleared, and the second one filled, and the third one produced a crowd of people who did not know which direction to go and needed someone to tell them. She had told them. She had been telling people which direction to go for 2 hours, which was not her job and was not what she had trained for, and was the thing that needed doing, so she had done it. She had also helped carry an elderly man with a broken hip 400 meters to a medical transport when the automated chair system malfunctioned, and she had talked a woman through a panic attack in the middle of the transport queue, and she had found Section 7. Section 7 of the Northern Terraforming Station's residential block was an older part of the complex, built in the first year of the colony, not yet fully integrated into the automated evacuation routing system. Alina had found Section 7 because she had gone back to check after the queue cleared, and something had felt wrong about the numbers, and she had gone to look and found 231 people who had not received the routing update that would have told them which transport hub to go to. She had told them. She had been moving them toward the hub when she found the old man. He was standing in the Section 7 corridor with both hands on his walker and a look on his face that Mara recognized as the specific look of someone who was not confused about what was happening, but was not moving anyway. She said, "Sir, we need to get you to the transport hub." He said, "I can't find Biscuit." Mara said, "Who's Biscuit?" He said, "My dog." Mara looked at the corridor, at the 231 people she needed to get to the hub, at the old man with the walker. She thought about the timeline. She thought about her mother, which she had been not thinking about for 2 hours. She said, "What does Biscuit look like?" It took 12 minutes. Biscuit was a small brown animal of indeterminate breed who had gotten into the ventilation access panel in the residential unit's kitchen, which was where small animals went when large and frightening things were happening, and who required patient encouragement to come out, which Mara provided while the old man waited in the corridor, and the 231 people waited with him, because nobody had told them to go ahead, and they were waiting to see what happened with the dog. Biscuit came out. The old man's face did something that Mara would not forget. She got him to the hub. She got the 231 people to the hub. The transport lifted off 40 seconds before the first collective weapons discharge hit the station's outer perimeter, close enough that the pressure wave was detectable in the transport's hull readings, not close enough to matter. Mara did not know how close it had been. She was already calculating how many more sectors needed checking. Alina did not know any of this. She was watching the casualty feed scroll. 17 UEDF vessels. In the third hour of the engagement, as the collective's pursuit elements adapted to OSI's 7-group separation tactic and began the kind of formation tightening that experienced fleet commanders used to limit their exposure to multi-directional engagement, 17 ships. 712 names. Alina watched every name. She had made that decision on the first day she had filed the full-weight construction orders 3 years ago. She had told Anand, who was the only person who knew she did this, who had never commented on it and never would, that the names were going on the secondary display in real time, and she was going to read every one of them. Because the names were the honest part. Everything else, the tactics, the architecture, the 3 years of preparation, the force ratios and the formation discipline and the positioning data, all of it was abstraction at some level. Abstraction that was necessary and justified and the best use of the resources available. The names were not abstract. The names were the cost column of the calculation, and you did not get to run the calculation without reading the cost column. She read 712 names. Then she said, "Anand, Phase 2 is ready." Anand said, "All strategic reserve units confirm ready, Commander." Alina looked at the last name on the feed. Petty Officer Yusuf Delgado, 26, Engineering Section, UES Relentless, listed as killed in action at 8:47 hours. She said, "Authorize Phase 2. For 14 months, 112 UEDF vessels had been moving. Not quickly, not on any heading that the collective's patrol network monitored. Through the deep spaces between the patrol corridors, the gaps in the coverage that Alina's intelligence division had spent 2 years mapping from passive sensor data, the routes that existed in the negative space of the collective's surveillance architecture. They had left their construction facilities 14 months ago. They had been in their final approach positions for 8 months, running completely silent, no active emissions, no transmissions. The particular discipline of ships that had been told they were the second part of the plan, and the second part did not exist, until the first part had run long enough to pull all of the collective's attention to one place. The collective's attention had been on the front of the engagement for 3 hours. Admiral Sophia Reyes was 56 years old and had spent 14 months in deep space on a mission that she had briefed to her fleet as the most important thing any of them would do in their careers. And she had meant it, and her fleet had believed her, which was why 112 vessels had maintained complete emission silence for 8 months in the dark between stars without a single breach of protocol. She looked at her tactical display when the Phase 2 authorization came through. She said all ships were authorized. You know your positions, execute. 112 UEDF vessels dropped out of stealth simultaneously at 7 positions around the engagement zone. Not in front of the collective fleet, not on the flanks, where formation doctrine provided coverage. Behind, precisely behind, each group positioned at a point that the collective's rear coverage had a gap in, gaps that existed because the collective had never needed to defend their rear in 200 years of expansion and had therefore never fully closed those gaps, because you did not close gaps against threats that did not exist. Alina had spent 3 years making the threat exist. On the collective flagship's tactical display, 112 new contacts appeared simultaneously from 7 directions, and Nethvaz looked at the display with the full attention of a man who had been making accurate assessments for 31 years and was now making the most important accurate assessment of his career. He looked at the positioning of the new contacts. He looked at their approach vectors. He understood in the space of approximately 4 seconds exactly what had happened, and what had been happening for however long those ships had been in position, and what it meant for the engagement. He said, very quietly, to no one in particular, "She planned this before the engagement started." His tactical officer said from the adjacent station, "Executor, 112 additional contacts. Unknown classification. They're not in our database." Nethvaz looked at the display. "They wouldn't be. She built them after the last assessment." He turned to his intelligence officer. "Get me the human warning document, the one from 3 years ago." His intelligence officer said, "Executor." The 40-page threat assessment filed with the Galactic Assembly. "I want Section 7. The document came up on the secondary display. Nethvaz read Section 7, which he had read 3 years ago and assessed as aspirational. He read it again now, standing in the middle of a fleet engagement that the document described in its operational concept with a precision that made the word aspirational feel like a significant misjudgment. The contingency architecture, the strategic reserve positioning concept, the specific force ratios that would obtain at the point of reserve deployment, the formation separation tactic that would draw the primary fleet into dispersed pursuit, enabling the reserve to arrive at uncovered rear positions. It was all there, 3 years ago, filed in the Galactic Assembly record, available to anyone who had read it and taken it seriously. He had read it, he had not taken it seriously enough. His tactical officer said, "Executor, we have contacts engaging from the rear on all 7 gap points. Our rear coverage is compromised." "I know." Nethvaz looked at his tactical display with the attention of someone doing very fast arithmetic. 168 total UEDF vessels, the original 73 now reduced by losses to 56, plus 112 strategic reserve. 139 collective vessels remaining after 3 hours of engagement. Formation discipline in the rear elements breaking down under the unexpected multi-directional pressure. He said to his flag captain, "Tighten the rear elements, pull in the outer pursuit groups." His flag captain said, "Yes, Executor." A pause. "It will take time." "I know." It took time. In the time it took, Ray's strategic reserve engaged the collective's rear elements with the precision of ships that had been running simulations of this engagement for 8 months and had positioned themselves for this exact moment. The rear elements, caught between the pressure from behind and the formation tightening order from the flagship, did what formation elements did when they received conflicting pressure. They adapted as best they could, which in a fleet of this size and with this response time meant they adapted partially and imperfectly. Partially and imperfectly was enough. Osai, from the front of the engagement, watched the strategic reserve's arrival on his tactical display and opened a channel to Reyes. He said, "Admiral Reyes, you're late." Reyes said, "We were in position 8 months ago, Commander. You're the one who took 2 hours to get here." Fair point. Welcome to our den. Good to be here. Shall we finish this? Please. The next 40 minutes cost both sides. The collective lost 60 more ships, 101 total across the engagement. Their remaining 139 were fighting with compromised formation discipline against 168 UEDF vessels, operating in a coordinated formation that the collective's tactical doctrine had no established counter to, because the formation had been designed specifically around the gaps in that doctrine, and gaps by definition were places the doctrine did not go. Nethvaz directed his fleet with the precision of 31 years of command. He adapted. He found partial solutions to the formation pressure. He extracted value from the collective's superior individual vessel capabilities where the engagement allowed it. He was, Alina would note in her after-action analysis, the best opposing fleet commander she had encountered in 22 years of service. He was not enough. The architecture was not designed to be beaten by good command. It was designed to be mathematically resistant to good command, and it was. Alina watched the math invert on her display. 168 against 139. Formation discipline on the collective's side compromised. The collective's best positions in the engagement closing off one by one as Osai and Ray's coordinated movement tightened the geometry around the remaining fleet. She watched the evacuation counter. 420,000 people off the planet, 180,000 still on the ground. She thought about her daughter. She stopped thinking about her daughter. The channel request from the collective flagship came through at 11:24 hours, which was 4 hours and 10 minutes into the engagement. Not a surrender transmission, which she had been prepared for. A direct channel request, which she had also been prepared for, because Nethvaz was the kind of commander who would want to speak to the person who had designed what he had just experienced. She accepted it. The entity on her screen was large by the standards of collective physiology, which ran towards significant mass and a gravitas of bearing that their culture had spent centuries cultivating. Nethvaz had 31 years of command behind him, and it was visible in the way he held himself, in the quality of his attention, in the fact that he was completely still despite everything that was happening around him on his bridge. He looked at Alina for a moment. Then he said, "You are the one who filed the warning." "Yes. I read it. I know. I assessed it as aspirational." Alina said nothing. Section 7, the contingency architecture, you described exactly this. The force ratios, the positioning concept, the formation separation tactic. A pause. It was in the document. Yes. The assembly filed it. They did. You built it anyway. Yes. A pause that lasted several seconds. The pause of someone adjusting their model of a situation to account for new data. Nethvaz said, "I have 139 ships. You have 168. My rear formation is engaged on 3 sides. My front elements are under sustained pressure." "I know. This engagement concludes one way." "Yes." He looked at her. "You could have prevented this 3 years ago if the assembly had acted on your warning." Alina said, "I know that too." Her voice did not change. It stayed at the level it had been since the beginning of this conversation, since the beginning of this day, since the beginning of 3 years ago. "That is why I built Fullweight, because I knew they would not act." Silence. Then Nethvaz said, "What do you want from this conversation, Commander?" Alina looked at her tactical display, at the evacuation counter. 453,000 people off Ardennes Prime, 147,000 still on the ground. She said, "My daughter is on that planet, along with 600,000 other people who spent 3 years building something there. I want the evacuation to finish. I want your fleet to stand down and withdraw, And I want you to return to your collective council and tell them that every human border system on your expansion vector has the same architecture behind it. Different positions, different timing, same outcome. Nethvaz said, and if I decline? Alina looked at the engagement display. At 168 UEDF vessels, at OS pressing from the front, at Ray's formation tightening from behind. Then we conclude the engagement, she said, and you return with 139 fewer ships than you brought and nothing to negotiate with. The silence lasted longer this time. Nethvaz was looking at something that was not his screen. His tactical display, probably. The math that Alina had been running for 4 hours, which he was running now for the first time and arriving at the same results. He said, "How long does your colony require?" 4 hours. A pause. 4 hours is a significant commitment. 147,000 people, executor. He looked at her. She looked at him. Two people who had been on opposite ends of a 3-year calculation, one of whom had known how it would resolve, and one of whom was arriving at that knowledge now. Nethvaz said, 4 hours. My fleet stands down, your fleet stands down, the evacuation proceeds. Agreed. And then your fleet withdraws. And I recommend to my government that we pursue formal contact with the Collective Council regarding the border systems question. A pause. I would rather have that conversation than the one we have been having today. Another pause, as would I in retrospect. Alina said, all UEDF vessels cease fire, hold current positions. She looked at the screen. I'll hold executor 4 hours. The engagement stopped. 168 UEDF ships, 139 collective vessels. The debris of what the past 4 hours had produced spread across the engagement zone in the particular silence of space after combat, which was the same silence as space before combat, and was different from it in every way that mattered. Alina sat in her chair and watched the evacuation counter. While the fleets held, she did something else. The Galactic Assembly's broadcast relay network had been carrying the proceedings and official records of 40 species for 300 years. Every assembly member monitored it. Most non-member species monitored it as a matter of practical necessity, because the Assembly's official communications were the closest thing to authoritative information available at the galactic scale. Alina had been thinking about the network for 3 years. About the specific function it served, about what it meant to put something on it, what reached whom, who read what appeared there and carried the weight of the Assembly's implicit institutional endorsement. She had decided, on the day the Assembly filed her warning and thanked her for her thorough analysis, that she would transmit to the network if it ever came to this. Not commentary, not argument, not anything that could be characterized as a political statement or a diplomatic maneuver. The record, exactly the record, every document from 3 years of formal submissions to the Assembly, every response, every filing notification, every acknowledgement that said your assessment has been received and noted, Commander, and did nothing else. The engagement record from today, the casualty figures, the names, 712 names, read from the secondary display, all of them transmitted now on the same network where the Assembly filed its official proceedings. She transmitted it without comment, without framing, without a single word beyond the documents themselves, which said everything they needed to say without her help. Anand watched the transmission go out and said, carefully, "They will say you bypassed Assembly protocols, Commander." The Assembly had 3 years to act on the protocols. They'll characterize it as political. It is a record. Every word of it is accurate. Every document was produced through formal channels and received formal acknowledgement. Alina looked at the casualty feed. I am putting the accurate record on the only network that reaches everyone who needs to have it. Anand was quiet for a moment. Then she said, what do you think they'll do? Alina looked at the names, 712. She had read every one. "They'll form a committee," she said. "They always form a committee." A pause. "But they will form it having read the names, all 712 of them. And a committee formed while reading names is different from a committee formed about an abstract concern. People can set aside abstract concerns. They have a harder time setting aside names." She looked at the display. "Get me the evacuation coordinator for the Northern Settlement Hub. I want to know their current rate." The 4 hours proceeded. At 2 hours and 17 minutes, the evacuation counter reached 500,000. At 3 hours and 4 minutes, Mara Vasquez-Chen was on her 40th run of the day. She had stopped counting the individual people sometime around the 100th, because counting was not useful when moving was useful, and she had been moving for 6 hours. What she had instead was a sense, developed over 6 hours of paying attention to how evacuation logistics actually worked rather than how they were supposed to work, of where the bottlenecks were and what they needed. The bottleneck at 3 hours and 4 minutes was a family in the Eastern Residential Corridor, mother, father, 3 children, youngest approximately 2 years old, who had missed the last transport out of their sector. The routing update had not reached their unit before the transport left. They were standing in the Eastern Corridor with the specific stillness of people who have been told to go somewhere and have gone there, and found that the thing they were supposed to get onto is not there anymore. Mara found them because she had developed the habit of checking the Eastern Corridor every pass, because the Eastern Corridor was the one that the routing algorithm consistently underserved. She said, "How long ago did the transport leave?" The father said, "Maybe 10 minutes." Mara looked at her map. The next transport going to a hub that could still receive them was at the southern pad, 30 kilometers on terrain that was partially completed terraforming surface, not road. She had a terraforming crawler. The crawler was rated for 15 passengers and was not rated for the speed she was going to need to go. She said, "Get in the crawler." They got in the crawler. She drove 30 kilometers in 22 minutes on terrain that the crawler's navigation system repeatedly flagged as suboptimal, and that Mara drove on anyway because the navigation system's definition of optimal did not account for what happened if she did not make the southern pad before its final transport lifted. She made it with 4 minutes to spare. The youngest child had fallen asleep somewhere on the terrain, her head against the crawler's side panel. When Mara stopped at the pad and opened the crawler door, the child did not wake up. Mara lifted her carefully and carried her to the transport and handed her to the father, who had been holding his composure for 30 kilometers and was continuing to hold it. The mother looked at Mara. She said, in the voice of someone who had not let themselves feel the full weight of the past 22 minutes and was not going to let themselves feel it until they were somewhere safe, "Thank you." Mara said, go now." The transport lifted. Mara stood in the empty pad and looked at the sky and thought about her mother. She took out her comm. The message would take 48 hours to arrive. Her mother would not read it until this was over, until whatever was happening in the space above Ardennes Prime had resolved one way or another, and Mara did not know which way it was resolving because she had been running people to transport pads for 6 hours and had not had time to check. She sent the message anyway. She wrote, "I'm okay. The evacuation is working. I helped a lot of people today. I think you'd be proud. I love you. Come see me when this is done. I want you to meet Don. He's good, Mom. He's really good. Come see us." She put the comm away. She went back to work. There were still people who needed transport. Alina did not read the message. She was watching the evacuation counter and the engagement display and the casualty feed and the assembly broadcast network response indicators, which had begun lighting up 40 minutes after she transmitted the documents, the 40-member species beginning the process of formally responding to what they had received. At 3 hours and 51 minutes, the counter read 587,412. Alina looked at that number. at the 600,000 she had wanted, at the 12,588 that were not in the number. She opened the channel to the collective flagship. Nethvaz appeared on the screen. He looked the same as he had 4 hours ago, which was the look of someone who had been running a very intense calculation for a long time and had not stopped. Elena said, "The 4 hours are up. We have 587,412 people off the planet. 12,588 are still on the ground. I need 2 more hours." A pause. Nethvaz said, "My council is expecting my report." "I know. 2 hours is a significant extension of an agreement that was already. 12,588 people, executor." The silence. The specific silence of someone who has been in command for 31 years and has made calculations that required setting aside numbers like 12,588, who has filed things under administrative language and operational necessity, and who is being asked to make a different kind of calculation now. The silence lasted 11 seconds. Nethvaz said, 2 hours, Commander." Elena said, "Thank you." She said it simply, she meant it simply. Then she said, "All units hold extended 2 hours." The 2 hours ran. A UEDF ground coordinator named Sergeant Tamaz Reyes had been running the Northern Settlement's final evacuation sweep for the last 90 minutes. He was 28 years old and had a gift for logistics, which was not a glamorous gift, but was the kind of gift that got 600,000 people off a planet, and he had been using it for 9 hours without stop. In the final 40 minutes, he found a woman in the Section 7 medical annex who had been missed by 3 previous sweeps because she was in a room that the system had marked as cleared. The room had been cleared. She had come back to retrieve something she had forgotten. She was 81 years old and had a portable oxygen unit and walked very slowly. He got her to a transport. He found 2 survey geologists who had come in on a transit shuttle 3 days ago and were not in the colony register and did not have evacuation assignments. He put them on the last available transport. He was doing a final walk of the northern hub when he found Mara Vasquez-Chen in the Section 4 connector corridor, checking a utility room that the routing system said had been cleared. He said, "Ma'am, what are you doing?" She said, "Checking. The system marked this cleared, but the door sensor log shows it was only opened for 11 seconds, which isn't long enough for a proper check." He looked at her, he looked at the corridor, he made a decision. "The transport leaves in 12 minutes, ma'am. I need you on it." She said, "There might be." "There is no one in there. I ran this corridor 40 minutes ago personally." He looked at her. "You have been running people to pads for 9 hours. You have done enough. I need you on the transport." She looked at the utility room door. He said more firmly, "The transport leaves in 12 minutes, ma'am." She looked at him. She made the calculation that people made when someone they trusted told them the job was done, a calculation that was harder than it sounded when you had been running for 9 hours and could not quite make yourself stop. She said, "Okay." She got on the transport. It lifted at 9 hours and 44 minutes after the evacuation started. Elena received the confirmation from the ground coordinator at 9 hours and 46 minutes. Final count, 600,004. She read the number, she closed her eyes. She sat in the Strategic Command Center with the folded document in her pocket and the tactical display showing 168 ships and 139 collective vessels, and the engagement zone quiet and the evacuation feed showing its final number, and she closed her eyes and she sat with the number. 600,004. 4 more than the colony register. She would find out who they were. She always found out. 712 names on the casualty feed. She had read every one. She would add them to the list she kept, the running list from 22 years of service, The name she had been carrying since the first engagement she had ever planned that had cost lives, because those names were the cost column, and you did not get to close the ledger. She opened her eyes. She looked at the tactical display. 139 collective vessels beginning their withdrawal, the formation precise and disciplined, the specific dignity of a fleet that had lost and was leaving with its integrity intact. She watched them go. Anand said, "Commander, the Assembly is requesting a formal response to the document transmission. The request is marked urgent." Alina said, "Tell them I'll be available in an hour. They've marked it urgent 3 times in the last 20 minutes. Tell them I'll be available in an hour." A pause. "Yes, Commander." The Strategic Command Center was full of people doing the work that came after. Damage assessments, fleet positioning, the administrative machinery of the aftermath. They were doing it without her because she had built a staff that did not need her to function, and she had done that deliberately, because a staff that could not function without you was a fragility, and she did not build fragilities. She reached into her desk. The document was paper. Actual paper, which nobody used anymore, printed from a file she had kept since 3 years ago because she had wanted it where she could see it. The cover page of the formal threat assessment submitted to the Galactic Assembly, with the Assembly's response at the bottom in 3 lines of formal bureaucratic language. "Your assessment has been received and formally noted in the record. The Assembly thanks Commander Vasquez for her thorough analysis. No further action is required at this time." She looked at it for a moment. She thought about the child in the morning market feed, running in the clear light of a terraformed sky. She thought about 712 names. She thought about 600,004 people on transports. She folded the document. She put it in her pocket. She said, "Anand, get me a relay channel to the Ardennes Prime evacuation fleet, specifically the passenger manifest for Transport 14. Anand said, "Transport 14, Commander." "Yes." Anand worked the board. "Commander, the passenger manifest for Transport 14 shows a Vasquez Chen M confirmed aboard. Departed Ardennes Prime at 9 hours 44 minutes. Currently in transit to Relay Station 7. Estimated arrival." Alina said, "She's on a transport." She said it quietly, to herself as much as to Anand, to the room, to the tactical display showing the withdrawal of a fleet she had spent 3 years preparing to face. She said it in the same level voice she said everything in, and underneath the level voice was the thing that had been there for 9 hours, for 3 years, for the length of time it took to build something and wait for it to be needed, and then watch it used. She said, "She's on a transport." Anand said carefully, "Yes, Commander, she is." Alina sat for a moment. The Strategic Command Center hummed around her, people working, the aftermath proceeding. The Assembly requests marked urgent on her board. The after-action reports beginning to populate. The long list of things that needed doing in the next hour and the next day and the next 3 years, which were going to be different 3 years than the last 3, because the collective's fleet had withdrawn, and the Assembly had the documents and the architecture had worked, and there was a different kind of work to do now. She said, "Get me a relay channel to Transport 14. Anand said, "Now, Commander." Alina thought about a message traveling through the relay network, 48 hours between a launch pad on a planet that was empty now and the desk where she was sitting. Her daughter's voice, tired and 24 years old, saying the things she had said from transport pads and utility corridors and 30-kilometer drives across unfinished terrain for 9 hours. She had said, "I think you'd be proud." She had said, "He's good, Mom." She had said, "Come see us." She said, "Yes, now." The channel connected. Her daughter's voice came through the relay, tired and staticky and alive, saying, "Mom." Alina said, "Hey, kid." A pause. Then, on the other end of 40 light-years and 48 hours of relay delay, compressed to real time by a quantum entanglement channel that cost more per minute than most people made in a year, and that Alina was going to justify on the after-action expense report as mission-critical communications. Her daughter said, "Are you okay?" Alina said, "I'm okay." "Is it over?" Alina looked at her tactical display. The collective fleet clearing the Ardennes system boundary, the UEDF formation holding, the evacuation counter at its final number, the document in her pocket. She said, "The hard part is over." A pause. "Mom, I need to tell you something." "I know, you've been running people to transports for 9 hours. Silence. Then, in the voice of someone who has not cried in 9 hours and is not going to cry now either, "How did you?" "I found the evacuation coordinator's logs." Alina looked at nothing in particular. Section 7, the old man with the dog. A very long pause. "Biscuit," Mara said. "Biscuit," Alina said. The silence was the specific silence of two people who were very alike in a way that neither of them had ever been able to say directly, and that was completely clear to both of them. Then Mara said, "I want you to meet Don." Alina said, "I know, I'm coming." "You said that last time." "I know." A pause. "I mean it this time." Another silence. Then Mara said, "Okay." Alina sat in her chair in strategic command, with the folded document in her pocket, and the tactical display showing a quiet system, and the casualty feed with 712 names that she would carry forever and 600,004 people on transports heading somewhere safe. And she talked to her daughter. The assembly could wait. The after-action reports could wait. Everything else could wait. Her daughter was on a transport. The planet was empty. The fleet was withdrawing. 712 people were in the record and 600,004 were not, and her daughter was saying, "I want you to meet Don, Mom," and she was saying, "I know, I'm coming." For right now, for the next few minutes, in the quiet aftermath of the most important thing she had ever built, that was everything. That was more than enough.